Thank you, Stefanos. When Stefanos invited me to chair, I was, it was like a bit of a deja vu all over again, because many years ago I did write something about the European welfare state, although the broad argument of the book was that social democracy had less to do with it than is normally assumed. So I don't know if that qualifies me to something like this. But then I was delighted to find myself on a panel with Patrick Weil, who is among the many hats that he wears, is also the head of Libraries Without Frontiers, which in this day and age of digital information surfeit does things like put libraries, or books at least, laundromat, which is so analog a way of spreading enlightenment that I find it almost impossible not to be charmed by it. So it's a pleasure to meet you, having been acquainted with your organization for a while. So we have three speakers: Jenny Andersson from Uppsala, Patrick Weil from Yale and CNRS, and Rui Tavares, an MEP, and now as a member of the Portuguese Parliament. Precisely what the theme is, I'm not sure, since none of these have titles, but we'll figure that out in the question. So without further ado, you've each got 20 minutes, and I will bang the gavel after that. We start with Jenny, please.
Okay, thank you. So I try to not raise my voice. I will speak at this level, and I hope you can hear me. So I gave my talk the title, "The Political Thought of Stabilizing Capitalism." And that is an indication of my view of what social democracy is. I think that social democracy, for a number of historical and theoretical reasons, is quite distinct from socialism. And the main marker of distinction is in the fact that social democracy is not, in history, an anti-capitalist movement. Rather, it contains a critique of capitalism. And I'm going to agree with what Sandrine began giving us in terms of definition yesterday by saying that, to my mind, that is not a lesser project, but rather social democracy contains a whole set of principles and theories, and also perhaps a particular way or art of governing, which sometimes or oftentimes we refer to as reformism. So reformism is what Sandrine introduced yesterday in these debates between Bernstein and Luxemburg. Most of you are very well familiar with this. And it has always been criticized from the left for being a fundamental accommodation with capitalism. And this is not less so today than in the past. And I'm going to agree with both Sandrine and with Sherry Berman, for instance, who was here in the morning yesterday, that reformism is a transformative ambition, but it's also an ambition that is full of tensions. And some of those tensions are honestly, I think, really not easy to see through today. And so therefore, I want to start this talk. I've divided into three parts. I want to start it by talking about a set of dilemmas produced in the relationship between social democracy and the industrial society from the late 19th century on. Then I want to bring back to the table what I think are a set of political principles from classical social democracy, if there was such a thing. That is a bit of a construction, of course, because we know that social democracy is a varied family. But then in any case, to my mind, are inherently future-oriented, because I think it becomes very difficult to think the future of capitalism without thinking about those principles also. Which is a problem that we don't have if we don't think of a future of capitalism. But personally, I think that the future without capitalism is further away than the future without social democracy, which is possibly quite close. And finally, I also want to speak about what Stephanie called yesterday actionables, or at least a set of what I think are possible building blocks. And I'll perhaps give away part of the bulk of this talk, which is that I'm a pretty classical Swedish social democrat. I don't think that all forms of policy innovation are conducive to solving the problems of our era, but I do think that in the history of social democracy are a few things that could arguably be brought back to the table today. I also want to flag that I'm going to leave the question of Europe and internationalization away, but I think it's a very important one, and I'm happy to come back to it in the discussion. So without further ado, Also, by the way, just very quickly by means of introduction. So I'm a professor of the history of political thought. I see a lot of students. I also see a lot of young social democrats. And I have been talking about the crisis of future of social democracy often in the same sentence for the last 20 years. And I find myself increasingly over time like some kind of custodian of a collective memory that is sort of increasingly lost. And I guess that some of this also reflects in the fact that I often address myself to young people and things that I think that they don't really understand because they don't have the experience, for instance, of the welfare state or of trade unions that I have. Okay, number one, social democracy is best thought of as a set of dilemmas and as a kind of ideological repertoire around those dilemmas. Now, the first of those is obviously in the relationship with capitalism, and in the way that many social democrats, through their ambition of ameliorating and modifying capitalism, have found themselves deeply entangled in the capitalist project. Mm-hmm. So historically, I think that social democrats solved or managed this dilemma by developing what I call a critique of capitalism. And to me, that is at the core of the social democrat project. And it also means that I think it's quite hard to consider some of the present day incarnations of social democrat parties actually social democrat, because to me, a minimum definition is that they have an ambition to keep a critique of capitalism alive. I don't expect them to want to abolish capitalism, but I would expect a certain awareness of an historical critique of capitalism and a willingness to update that for our times. The critique of capitalism historically had at least, but in my view, three dimensions. It was economic. So there was the idea that industrialism did things that were wasteful, inefficient, and poor. For instance, that bust cycles created mass unemployment, or that capital could sometimes be directed towards suboptimal use. There was a social critique of capitalism. So this is, for instance, the idea that competition destroyed the social fabric and worker communities. It's the idea also that work is a socially more useful kind of activity than speculation, and therefore the basis of a socially just economic order. It's also the idea that people cannot be whole individuals without a set of social rights, and transferred to visions of the political sphere that became social democracy. Third, the critique of capitalism was also ethical. So if the first rather economistic notion shared with other critics of capitalism that in the period from the late 19th century, 20th century on actually existed in social liberalism or in social conservatism, the idea that capitalism was an immoral order in breach of natural rights also borrowed from the kind of utopianism that we heard someone speak about yesterday, and that went back, in fact, a long time in history to medieval worker organizations. So these three forms of critiques in history have been key, I think, in providing social democracy with a kind of register for thinking about how capitalism could be made better, how good and bad uses of capital could be identified, and also into a set of different social and political visions that have stopped a pure economism, which arguably is a latent kind of thinking in the social democrat project. And I think that that was true up until a couple of decades ago. And that certain parts of the social democrat heritage, precisely to do with this, have been lost. Okay, that was the first dilemma. The second dilemma is in the relationship to the industrial society and in the idea of economic growth. So Swedish social democrats are probably some of the best growth managers in the world. And arguably they became so because the idea of growth in the 20th century seemed to offer solutions to the problem of redistribution. And so we need to see very clearly that the welfare state and its social policies built on a form of resource extraction that provided the economic resources for redistribution with a relatively small degree of social conflict. And this relied on the perception that natural resources were unlimited. This is at the core of the project of the welfare state, if we think about it retrospectively today. Now, at several points in time, social democracy has confronted for various forms of ideological problems with economic growth. Today, we focus on the environmental costs of growth, But a fundamental debate for social democrats in the 20th century was the post-war debate about the social costs for growth in relation to new technologies, rationalization, mechanization, and also information and communication technologies, or so-called post-Fordism. And so the problem of growth has always, I think, in the 20th century, post-social democracy, in front of a problem of value hierarchies. So there is an ideological dispute, which I think is still unsettled today, which is about what is more important, what comes first: economic growth, quality of life, environmental preservation, and how to orient this triad of objectives. A third dilemma of the social democrat project, which to me is really core to 20th century political history, is the one between workers and consumers. So we know that a distinction between socialism and social democracy is that social democracy turned to the nation, away from the global republic of the workers of the world. And as they did so, they also, this is very central to the Nordic countries where social democrats did not nationalize production, but key forms of consumption, they identified in workers a key consumer interest. And so for this consumer interest, social democrats had to protect, for instance, cheap consumer goods and foodstuff, even if that meant disregarding the conditions of workers in other parts of the world. So hence, resource extraction was complemented in the post-war era by forms of global exploitation. And here are also acute issues today. But I think that part of the crisis of social democracy is in fact an inherently tension-ridden relationship between the global and the international, and between nature and workers or people. And we can see in the crisis of social democracy from the 1970s on, for instance, a fractured relationship between party and trade unions, but also a fractured relationship between European social democracy and third world actors, as Sandrine also pointed out yesterday with relation to the new international economic order. A final dilemma of social democracy is about the relationship between the working class as its historic agent and the notion of the people as a larger entity. And so again, a defining marker of social democrat parties is the turn to the people, the idea that social democracy cannot speak to one class interest, but has to speak to a plurality of class positions and an overarching idea of the common good. And to that, we have to add today that we are working out how to include future generations into that notion of the people. Okay, that was part one. Those were some dilemmas. And in a sense, every generation of social democracy returns to these dilemmas, has to work them out again. And that is why we can also speak about waves of revisionism in the history of the social democrat project. So we have a moment of revisionism in the late 19th century, which is precisely about these dilemmas. We have an interwar moment of revisionism that is, again, rethinking the relationship between social democracy and capitalism. A major moment of rethinking the idea of the working class and the people in the 1950s. In the 1990s, the whole third wave turn that we spoke about yesterday. And I think that today we are in such a moment of revisionism again, and it's really about rearticulating the relationship between social democracy and the world, now with a kind of futurity to it that is pressing, but that is also, I think, really a complete existential challenge to the social democrat project. And I will leave it there because I don't have the solution, but I just want to point out that I think that it's very hard to separate social democracy from the industrial society in the way that arguably we need to start doing. Okay, second part, social democracy is a set of political principles that are key to the functioning of capitalism. The first of those principles is, again, the idea of work, and the idea that work is a socially productive activity. So Marx said capital is a set of social relations. Well, social democrats say work is a set of social relations at the core of our societies, as opposed to detrimental activities, for instance, speculation or rentier capitalism. So I think that social democracy has always had a major problem in understanding financial capital, but it's very interesting to me that the debate on financial capitalism has not really progressed more in the social democrat project, and is, at least I see very little of it in the last 20 years or so. The second principle, which I also mentioned before, is the question of the plurality of class interests in a democratic industrial society. So social democracy, in my view, is a democratic theory of class relations. In other words, it recognizes that there are different classes. It recognizes that, I'm not saying these are my positions, by the way, it recognizes that ownership of capital can have a socially just and economically useful function. And it also recognizes, as argued, for instance, by theoreticians like the Swedish Ernst Wigforss or Anthony Crosland in the UK, that there is such a thing as merit and talent, and part of the social democrat notion of freedom is the idea that people should be allowed to pursue their potential, including accepting that this may have economic rewards that create injustices in the short term. But, said Ernst Wigforss, the reward for merit and talent is only just for as long as it's not allowed to cement differences between classes. Because if it cements differences between classes, then it stifles the opportunities of future generations. That is not a small but, okay, which is very often left out in contemporary debates about taxation. So this led to an argument about taxation, and importantly about progressive and proportional taxation. That is, we have to tax people differently because merits and talents lead to different places in economic hierarchies. The third principle that I think is key to social democracy and to the relationship with capitalism is the idea of the welfare state. And this, I think, is a really hard argument today because a lot of people associate the state with nostalgia and with disciplinarist institutions and paternalism, or even worse. I mean, young people in Sweden sometimes see the welfare state as a form of eugenics and national socialism and what have you. And so I can see that people on the left have issues with the state. And it's certainly also correct that there are strands within social democracy that were not statist, but for instance, turn to things like worker councils, etc. But I think that social democracy is a statist project. And I think that very deeply in the social democrat ideological view is the opposition to the bourgeois state. So in Sweden, there was not a bourgeois state as repressive as the one in Germany, but nevertheless, I think that we see in the late 19th century and early 20th century debates a huge focus on the importance of developing an alternative conception of the state that is the benevolent state, that is the nice and kind and friendly and loving state that provides welfare to people, and that is not the world market protecting, warfaring imperial state of Marx. And in Nordic social democracies, a large emphasis was really placed in the early 20th century on how to convert the state apparatus from this bourgeois state into a democratic welfare state. I think that this is important because I think we are confronted with problems of scale today, including climate change, for instance, but also redistribution, that are very hard for me to think about without some idea of the state. And I think one of the things we need to think about is how to turn the state into a benevolent ideal, into a kind of utopian notion again. And so a really central thing here is that social democrats opposed the Bismarckian vision of the state or the welfare state as a conservative order, as the status quo, and rather addressed the welfare state as a transformative project at the service of social mobility and not discipline. And at the heart of that was the notion of social citizenship as applying to all within the territory, regardless of ethnicity or origin, and that as an unalienable right and as the foundation of political democracy. So I'll turn very quickly to the last part. Is that okay? Yeah. Which is about social democracy as an art of governing. And so I want to talk about some aspects of reformism as an art of governing, and I want to mention a few kind of dusty, nostalgic old things. And I could have put other things in this list, but I thought I'd say some words that had not really been mentioned during the conference. And so I think that some of these things were components in the stabilization of the post-war order. And I think that they could be also quite important today, perhaps not in the same shape, but at least as a way of slowly claiming back ground. So the first thing is quite clearly taxation. So we have all spoken about taxation. Marx said, from each according to capacity, to each according to need. Ernst Wigforss said, quite pragmatically, he was a Swedish social democrat, that the marginal use of the last krona, so the last dollar, to the wealthy man was lesser than the marginal use of the last dollar to the poor, and therefore taxation must be proportional and progressive. Sweden has today a tax system in which the progressivity has been drawn back significantly. Sweden is, to my knowledge, the only country in the world which also has no inheritance tax, no capital gains tax, and no property tax. And the culmination of those different tax logics is devastating in terms of inequalities. So it's clear that social democrats need to have not simply a view of taxation, but a view of what it is that taxation is supposed to achieve and what the underlying morality in the tax system is. And that is actionable. That is not a revolution. That is something that can be politically done. The second thing is wage policy. So wage policy is a 1970s term familiar from Sweden and the UK, for instance. And it did not mean historically that the state decided on wages. The state did not set worker wages, but it meant that social democrat parties and trade unions in corporatist tripartite arrangements led societal conversations on socially useful occupations and their relative pricing. It meant that social democratic parties and trade unions established forms of solidarity within the worker collective. So between high skill and low skill workers, between blue and white collar workers, between women and men, for instance, in high performing industrial sectors and low performing gendered activities like care. I think it's crucial that we reclaim this terrain. Another 1970s term is the mixed economy. So a central feature of the Nordic model was that at its apex sometime in the mid-1970s, 50% of GDP, I know it sounds shocking, but this is the case, 50% of GDP consisted of, in various ways, publicly owned or controlled production in the public sector. So I am not sure that we have to have public sectors that are in the form of state-controlled companies or so on, but I think we could think about alternative ways. But I think that there is something in what the American economist Galbraith called the social balance of setting aside a part of the economy that is that produces in other terms than in profit-seeking terms. And it seems to me that it's not by chance that a 50% target corresponds to a time in history when we also have the highest levels of social equality in the Nordic countries. And final word. There is a question about the short-term and the long-term perspective, and a question about the alliances of social democracy. And so again, with Wigforss, who had this notion of provisory utopias. So provisory utopias meant to Wigforss that each little reform needed to be tied up to a larger analysis of the roadmap toward social equality. Now, this, I think, today is a crucial challenge. Why? Is it because social democrats do no longer think about equality? No. Is it because they are somehow less capable of thinking in utopian terms? No. But social democrat parties are not dominant parties in European electoral systems. And I don't think that there is any such thing as owning the narrative of modernity and progress anymore. At least it does not come easy. We also live in an era that is defined by the collision between, on the one hand, fundamental future challenges, like world-defining political problems, and the near impossibility of creating the kind of larger societal and political alliances that we need for their solution. So here, I think that social democrats have a larger responsibility than simply governing in the present. I think there is a responsibility for educating the politics of the present for the long term. There is a very difficult issue here of alliances. And I almost cannot believe that I'm saying this. There is a question of building a new center ground in the name of those long-term challenges, a necessary alliance between worker and middle class, finding shared positions and silent majorities around central transformative issues, such as, for instance, new forms of taxation, or such as, for instance, renationalizing the school systems in Sweden, things that can make people meet. And I also think that a crucial task here is to actively work on the liberal and conservative right, because neither xenophobia nor market fundamentalism are dominant values in contemporary societies. They become dominant values, or apparently dominant values, because of the failure to protect the center ground. And I think that, unfortunately, a certain number of social democrat policies are only possible when that center ground exists. And therefore, it's very hard for us to do without, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are not only punctual the show early, and you set an excellent example by coming in not quite at a time, but pretty close to it, which is
very good.
Surprisingly non-common in these situations like this. So, fellow panelists, please take that as a good example to follow. And
so thank you very much, Stefanos, for having invited me. I still don't understand why he has invited me, because except for that, in my 40 years ago, I was a leader of the Young Socialists and the youngest member of the board of the Socialist Party when Mitterrand won the election. Since I've become an academic, and I have not worked neither on inequality nor on social democracy, but I have done some work that permit me to make a presentation that is also informed by a kind of old political experience. So let me challenge a little, very friendly, what Paul said this morning. So let's start with what I agree with him on, that we have the information. We have the information of inequality. Economists have worked a lot to brought us this data. We have the information of the global warming. We even have, as François Ruffin recently said in an interview, he says we have now the cultural domination on these ideas, that people believe that it's true that there are this very harsh and high inequality and big danger for the planet, etc., etc. Nevertheless, we are losing election. And we are losing election not to sometimes to the center right, but now more like in Italy, to the extreme right. And the perspective of the next European Parliament election is not that the Green is going to rise, but they are going to go down. That is a past poll that shows that. And the extreme right is going to rise, so that you have this incredible gap between what is described as all the information we have, all the domination, cultural domination we have, and the election outcome. Our democratic institutions are at risk if this party wins, but even when they don't win, for example, in my country, the independence of the press, independence of the justice, all that is at risk under pressure of the government. And the social democratic heritage we have, especially in Europe, public free education, free access to healthcare, all that has been very well described this morning. I'm sorry I was not here yesterday, by marketization, not exactly total privatization, but the marketization leads a worse service, and the worse service lead to people rejecting the public service and willing to get a better service through privatization. It's what's happening in France now with a private education sector, which is rising in numbers and in support, etc., by the public and by the state. So that can lead to a total different scenario than the very optimistic that has been designed this morning, which is what the one I call the social Darwinism, which is let's the poor die, not either from the heat or from bad healthcare that will not cover new sickness or old sickness, etc. And let's have the wealthiest survive by all means. And what is interesting is that scenario was thought about in the United States in a very interesting moment which I teach in my class in law and religion. It was in the Scopes trial. You know, it was the trial that involved the teaching of evolution, of Darwinism, that brought a massive attention of the American public. And of course, if the rational and the social were on the side of the teacher who wanted to teach Darwinism, but the lawyer who was on the other side was the former Secretary of State of Wilson, who was a former candidate in the Democratic candidate Bryan, who was on the left of the Democratic Party. And why was it? He was, of course, a believer, a Christian believer, but he said that if he was afraid that children being taught the survival of the fittest would in time stop caring about the poor and otherwise neediest members of the population, and go to that theory of social change, which also could be shared on more, I would say, Protestant values that the best are chosen by God, etc. So you have this tendency, especially in American society, of Darwinism and social Darwinism. After all, the poor are poor because it's they don't have the talent or the skills of the others. So how do we fight and defeat? So how do we explain the state first we are in now? I would talk about some aspect, not talk about everything, but let's talk about the social democrat responsibility. That facing globalization and the neoliberalism ideological domination, a lot of social democratic parties accompanied, and the French one especially, this neoliberal turn. And they let, in fact, the defense of nation state, of national construction of the state, etc., in many dimensions, to the nationalists, to the racists, to the anti-Semites, to the people we are facing now in the election, and a nation become nationalists, etc., and they lost finally their legitimacy, and that is something that is also expanded here. There is a loss of legitimacy of the democratic institution, the parties, the parliaments, the elected people, the academics, which is extremely fragile. And let me quote a very interesting scholar, which I discovered recently. I don't know if you know him. He's an Italian, Guglielmo Ferrero, who in 1942 published in New York, in fact, the year of his death, a book in French in New York called Le pouvoir, les génies invisibles de la cité. So on power, the invisible genius of the city. And it's an extremely rich and very intelligent book. And he challenged Max Weber's category of the classical one, charismatic, rational, or rational democratic or traditional, by having four of them, the aristo-monarchist, the egalitarian, and then the one that organized democracies, elective and democratic. And using his category, I would say that we are now, I think we are in a situation where the elective is being split from democratic. People still elect their leaders with less and less participation, but they feel they are not in a democratic system that represent them, that they represent their interests, etc. And that is, I think, the very dangerous situation we are in, this differentiation between elective and democratic. And so, what can we do? And here I will challenge a lot people. It is that the best text I have read, sorry, I would wish I would have written it, on what can we do, is a text I have discovered a few years ago of Isaiah Berlin, which somebody know for you, is on political judgments. And let me quote him. What is to have a good judgment in politics? What is to be politically wise or gifted, to be a political genius, or even to be no more than political competent, to know how to get things done? So it is exactly what Paul's question was. How do we get things done? And in fact, he says, the gift we means entails above all a capacity for integrating a vast amalgam of constantly changing, multicolored, evanescent, perpetually overlapping data. Too many, too swift, too intermingled to be caught and pinned down and labeled like so many individual butterflies. To integrate in this sense is to see the data, those identified by scientific knowledge as well as by direct perception, as element of a single pattern, which their implication, to see them as symptoms of past and future possibility, to see them pragmatically, that is in terms of what you or other can or will do to them, and what they can or will do to others or to you. To see, so let me end, it is in a sense, it is a sense for what is qualitative rather than quantitative, for what is specific rather than general. It is a species of direct acquaintance as distinct from a capacity for description or calculation of inference. It is what is variously called natural wisdom, imaginative understanding, etc., etc. So what it says here is that it is a capacity not to rely on all the production of academics, which are useful, but are only some of elements of this picture that has to be taken and transformed by political action, but cannot rely, this political action cannot get what to do from directly from the academic world. And I have seen in my country a lot of academics saying the politicians are not following the academics. Well, they should not follow the academics. They should get their information, but they should do their work, which is to do this, go on the ground and get from the voters and from that some European politicians, like the current prime ministers of Spain, have succeedingly done. Go on the ground and get what he needed to get from the voters and connected it with the knowledge, etc., and produce a policy options, a narrative, etc., that can lead to victory. So, to try to understand the moment we are in, let me give you some of my hypotheses. Of course, they can be contested, and I hope they will be contested. When I heard this morning Paul and others speak about planning and planification, let's remember that planning started during the First World War. In fact, Raymond Mollet, who was the first designer, of the first New Deal, wrote in the middle of the 50s an op-ed in the Time magazine saying, the most important economic text of the 20th century, beside Karl Marx's Capital, is the conference given by Walter Raslow at the end of 1915, when he went out from his job at the War Office, the Prussian War Ministry, where he has designed the connection between the state and the industries to react to the blocus he knew Germany would face after the entrance of England in a coalition with France and Russia. And in fact, when you read what was the basic principle of rational policy, raw material were brought under state control. Their exchange were no longer left to the free play of economic forces, but was subordinated to the public interest. Stock of raw material were built up by purchase from neutral country, especially by Belgium, in fact. And And you had, it was a decisive step, I quote Rasno, toward state socialism. But it was borrowed by Wilson, who when he created the War Industry Bureau, and when he done also with Hoover the agriculture. He organized completely administratively the agriculture production of the United States. And then it was borrowed by FDR because Mollet borrowed. So you had this instrument where, and all, if I have read well the Piketty, the first main Piketty book, all the taxation that was very high after the war, it was a result of the war. It didn't come from democratic debate in a peacetime. It come at a moment where the power, democratic power, can reorganize completely the taxation, the organization of production, etc., etc. Now let me add you somebody that is not foreign to this Remark Institute, a quotation by Tony Judd. Tony Judd, in a conference, in a text published, which was "What is Living and what is Dead from Social Democracy," he said, he concluded his text saying that the following: if social democracy has a future, it will be a social democracy of fear. Rather than seeking to restore a language of optimist progress, we should begin by reacquainting ourselves with the recent past. The first task of radical dissenters today, which is a social democrat in his mind, is to remind their audience of the achievement of the 20th century, along with the likely consequence of our heedless rush to dismantle them. So I think, and I don't want to advance. I have an extraordinary quotation of Roosevelt. If I have 2 minutes at the end, I will read it. How he sold in the last interview he gave to the New York Times before the 1932 election, when he connected the war, what happened at the end of the First World War, when he went to Paris with Wilson, and the fear faced by American voters of being brought on by the economic crisis to a terrible situation. And so I would say that instead of having this language, I'm sorry to say, which is I love care and the great future, etc., we should have a language of war and fear, and to sell the transformation that we want to develop with the cultural domination we have, but not culturally, but not in the election. So war, after all, I think the term war was used by Johnson, war on poverty. So that if it was used that way, it is that it's a term that mobilizes. And so I would suggest that war should be used to raise the multilateral, the multinational, the world mobilization against global warming, which should be a world war for the saving of the planet. And and we should think about the different level of intervention based on that's my first item. But the second thing is that we have to reestablish the nation state as a basis of democratic politics. After all, it is the only arena where people can understand themselves when they talk to each other because they speak the same language, and they can vote, and they can, so it is the basic unit of a democratic, because if we are social democrat, we are social, but we are also democratic. And if we should not forget that, and there is an issue of reviving democracy, with basic democracy as a reviving of citizenship as a very important element of the program. So what could be a program? I would say again here something that is based on my political experience, but Of course, I've read and I've listened this morning to all the, we should tax all the billionaires, etc. Okay, it's progressing in Europe. Yes, Norway just taxed the billionaire, and the billionaire announced that they left Norway. And so I would say we should choose a first target that would be consensual. And what I'm seeing one target, I saw that in the US, when you have the deadlines on that, tax evaders. Tax evaders cannot be supported anywhere, even by the Republican in the United States. When one of the founder of Facebook changed his American citizenship to become whatever, I don't know. And it's why I'm interested in this field, because it's about nationality. So I think one of the first, which could target, which should be a European and a world target, because we can have treaty with the big power, because they all agree, the Chinese, the Russians, everybody dislike the tax evader. It should be the way of having a world tax that might go, for example, for the expenses to fight global warming. We should revive citizenship. We should have planning that could lead to nationalization, for example, of water, to very active policy like reviving of train on small lines that will make people feel that fighting global warming is not against them. It's not decreasing their resource. It is putting at their service, at their disposal, collective resource. Let me finally, because I have 5 minutes, let me end by one question I want to raise. Implicitly, I felt that the question about the future of democracy was for Europe. What about the United States? I mean, after all, the fear of Trump, the fear of abolition of the right to abortion brought a lot of voters in the poll. The fear on Trump is the only way to win the next election. I think it's otherwise it's so you have and the way Biden is. I mean, why limiting the debate and all this world creation were done in the United States, and the New Deal was done in the United States. So it's not because we don't have a why limiting. After all, Europe is very complicated to manage in terms of creating a common action policy. The US is very centralized in some way. And so it's the last question I want, and because I have the 2 minutes, I think I would like to read you the Roosevelt text I wanted to read. So just before the vote of November 1932, he told the New York Times, "No man can cross the continent in this time and remain the same. I find conditions different and worse than I expected. I have looked in the faces of thousands of Americans, and they are faces of people who want. I don't mean the unemployed alone. Of course, they would take anything. I mean those who still have jobs and don't know how long they last. They have the frightened look of lost children. And I don't mean a physical want alone. There is something more. I was in Paris when Wilson first went over. I watched the crowd in the streets, and I noticed there, particularly in the faces of women, the same expression I see here today, a kind of yearning. There, they were thinking of the war. Perhaps this man, their eyes were saying, can save our children from horror and terror we have known. Now, they are saying, we are caught in something we don't understand. Perhaps the fellow can help us out. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be back at the Remark Institute. I was here in the fall of 2016, which is a year that will appear again in my presentation. It was a frightening but also fascinating period, and the Remark Institute was my observation deck into that turning point in recent political history. The title of my presentation is Objects of Political Desire, the Past and Future of the Political Left. And my exhortation here in the beginning is that the left, the Social Democrats, Progressives, Greens, in Europe, in North America, and everywhere in the world have to pay more attention to feelings, to affections, to emotions, to sentiments, to what in the past was called passions, and have to understand the language of passions, because we may have many plans, but if we have a plan and we don't have passion, we don't win. We don't persuade people. Emotions is where the rubber hits the road in political terms. And it is often said that technocracy and technocratic politics, particularly in Europe, where technocracy was so strong in the European integration process, have displaced politics. That everything that could be solved technocratically was meant to evacuate politics from the scene. It is not completely correct. There was still lots of political discussion. I also believe that the European project and the European Union were not a social democratic construction. It was a joint venture between liberals, Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, even Euro-communists, later on Greens, but they all shared this idea from one Altiero Spinelli to Jacques Delors, that if we manage to get the economic policies right, that we will have a kind of an output legitimacy to the European project that would make the rest of the problems disappear. And the problems were, what were in their mind, were the high intensity passions of the interwar period. So technocracy was not meant to displace politics, but to displace passions. Like in the great Albert Hirschman, who lived that period very closely, the dichotomy between the passions and the interests that were a way to manage the passions and to control the passions, that were arguments for capitalism before the capitalism's advent, also at a certain point became part of the language of social democracy and progressivism. But passions remain and emotions remain at the cornerstone of politics. Adam Smith wrote his theory of moral sentiments before The Wealth of the Nations. In Spinoza's Ethics, there's lots of material about the emotions that are often overlooked, and we have forgotten emotions at our own risk. As the French say, what goes out through the door comes back through the window, and 2016 was precisely that year where we saw a great repoliticization of the masses through the emotions, but by the political right, not the political left. When we looked at the Clinton versus Trump election, well, Clinton was seen as the insincere technocrat who was always fearful of saying things as they were, and Trump was the liar, the one that exaggerated everything with the language of fear. American cities were hellholes, the rest of the world was enemies, and we had to go back to the past to make America great again. It was an election won on sentiment, on passions. And since then, we have had a huge trouble knowing what to do with that. Some people say that we must have, and here, and we didn't agree this, but I'm going to disagree with Patrick, that we must have our own version of fear. And actually, I come from an eco-socialist party, a part of the European Green Party, and I feel that among the Greens, we use and even abuse that a lot. The idea is that with climate change, we finally have our own version of fear. And because fear is such a potent feeling politically, because it is very monopolistic, when we fear something, we cannot think about anything else, that we must also have our own fear as the right wing, as the national populists have. And some others have caved, to neoliberalism as a language of choice. As long as I can choose, everything is all right. My recommendation is that we adopt a language of desire, desiring things, desiring big objectives, big, bold, ambitious objectives for the left as our own language. Why not fear? Because if we are afraid of the future or afraid of the present or afraid of the rest of the world, our first reaction, our first instinct is to close ourselves and to give ourselves up to authoritarians, even of the left. And because fear brings with itself an idea that is by its own nature reactionary, which is that something in the past was better. So it's we have to choose the kind of sentiment that is structurally and functionally as important for progressivism as fear is for reactionarism. It cannot be the same sentiment. It cannot be a left-wing version of what the right wing says. It cannot be a left-wing version of national populism. It must be something else. So, there are the things that elicit fear today are immigration, globalization, artificial intelligence, climate change. And by capturing the language of fear, the right wing has managed to create new splits, new political splits in the global societies. They are less of left versus right, or even of rural versus urban, as they are. The comparison that I find most inspiring is the one that comes from medieval Italy, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Societies were, with proto-capitalism, societies were divided between those that were well off with this nascent capitalism. Florence was, of course, Guelph. Siena was Ghibelline. The Guelphs were more republican, the Ghibellines more imperial, the Guelphs more urban, the Ghibellines more rural and territorial. And what we have, but we can put it in another way, is the ones that have reasons to have resentment of the Guelph elites that are in New York, in Lisbon, and Istanbul, Rio, São Paulo, etc., and the left behind communities that have this Ghibelline sentiment. This is the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, of course, are a pre-modern political polarization that is different from the left and the right, but that is, for me, very interesting because it has emerged in a period of great uncertainty where people didn't know how they should organize themselves. The division between the left and the right is of a different nature. I tend to use a very straightforward archaeological definition. In the National Assembly in Versailles, when the left versus right terms appeared in their political sense, the left was, they sat on the right of the room, but the left of the presidency, they were against the king's veto, and the right wing was for the king's veto. What this means for me is that the right feels that it is natural to keep either tradition or naked power or inequality as the essence of the exercise of power, and that the left says that we can reinvent power in each new stage of our development. This is also why I'm going to disagree, and maybe we can discuss later on the idea that we must go back to the nation state. I think that if we look at the history of the left, conservatives were the imperialists, liberals were the nationalists because of self-determination theory, and the socialists were the cosmopolitans. We see that in the iconography of the workers' movement in the 19th century. Before the hammer and the sickle, before the Red Star, the iconography was the planet. It was a terrestrial globe with the workers, maybe with a torch in their hand, illuminating the world. It was, from the outstart, a cosmopolitan movement. And if we are to respond to globalization, to the emergence of artificial intelligence, to climate change, there's no point, and there's no other point, if not just to answer the national populists, for us to go back to the nation state as the proper political sphere. Actually, because the big fight is not a fight between the locals and the globals, as it is, of course, presented by the political right. It is a fight between the people who think that sovereignty is a particle and people that think that sovereignty is a wave. We can go into details in the discussion, but I think that the proper left-wing position is to think that sovereignty isn't there precisely because of the Versailles National Assembly, first emergences emergence of the term left versus right. The right believed that sovereignty was a particle, and the sovereignty is a particle that rests on the king. That's why the king should still have a veto even after the revolution. And the left thinks that sovereignty is a wave. It's something that we can create and recreate collectively. No reason to think that it can only be done at the national level. We are here speaking between people of several nations, and we can decide democratically what we want. If we decide to stop this debate here, go for a glass of wine or whatever, it's democratic, it's transnational, and it's emerging precisely like sovereignty as a wave. But I want to think about two possible refutations to what I am saying. Among the left and Greens, there are many who say that the proper path that we should choose to power is one of either contestation or resentment. Let's deal with the first. We have had many successes, and particularly the Greens say this a lot, in fighting nuclear plants or armament or whatever with contestatory politics. That, I think, it's something of the beginning of the movement that does not apply now. If we want to persuade a majority of people, and if we are Democrats, we need to persuade a majority of people that we want to govern and implement our objects of political desire, to move closer to a vision that we have of the future. Pure contestatory politics does not work. It is very effective among the far right and the right, but it's because they are in a process of deconstruction of the political system. That also does not interest us, because we do not want to go away with rule of law, fundamental rights, and democracy in general. So, setting aside contestation, the other idea is, what about resentment? Because people have fair reasons, they have just reasons to feel that resentment. And if we don't use it, then the right wing will use it. This, I think, is a strong claim. But for reasons that are linked with the idea that fear is functionally a sentiment that is much better for reactionaries than for progressives, I think that's resentment, although you can use resentment in a politically productive way, in class war, so to say. But I think that it is not as mobilizing as desire, which is what I'm going to recommend that we use. Desire is stronger than fear. It is probably one of the very few things that makes us, if you have anxiety, or if you're in a panic at home or whatever, and if you want to go out, desire is one of the very few things that will make you leave your bed and go out on the street. But desire by itself doesn't work. We need to have desire, and we need to explain people why not fear, why not having fear. I think that, it's a much quoted Roosevelt's phrase, but the phrase that the only thing that we have to have fear is fear itself still applies. He had to dispel those fears in order to implement a progressive plan. So first thing, he had to explain the mechanics of people, the mechanics of fear to people, which he did very pedagogically, via his radio talks, in order then to say that if you do not have fear, this plan might just work. And then we can create social security, we can regulate banking, etc., etc. So what should be our objects of political desire today? I think that when we on the left, in general, have had our third way neoliberal dominated moment, our technocratic moment, the left presented itself too much, and it still presents itself too much as a kind of a spreadsheet movement. If all the calculations are right, and if we can tax from here and put there, then we can explain how to get out of the crisis where we are in. And meanwhile, while we are studying our spreadsheets, Trump is there speaking to the rage of the masses and maybe even winning elections. I don't think that we should be a kind of a spreadsheet movement, although of course we have to have our calculations right, and we have to finance our programs. But the proper way to engage with the political debate that has changed a lot, because there have been, and we can discuss them, structural transformations of the public sphere again in this 21st century, is to have a vision of the future and to have some examples of how we reach this vision of the future through objects of political desire. But also remember, this is nothing new. In history, our movements were created by people who wanted to achieve very practical things. And sometimes they were objects, they were really things. People would not, enter a trade union just because of the trade union, because they enjoyed long meetings or long speeches, or amendments. You do not enter a political party because of that. You are not a part of the suffragist movement because you also, enjoy just, making demonstrations and being arrested. You want to have something. You want to have 8 hours work. You want to have votes for women. You want to have, social security. Those are proper. You want to have the NHS. Those are objects of political desire that also, because they are objects of political desire, that they also focus the loyalty of the people that have benefited from them. So when Andrew Sutton was speaking of, his mom being a cleaner in the NHS, the most loyal constituency of the left are the people that have benefited from social programs and that have been lifted from the lower classes into the middle classes. We must ask ourselves, why doesn't that work today, for instance, in Latin America, where millions have come out of poverty and they attribute their newfound, security in life to God, if they're evangelicals or neo-Pentecostals, or because if they are ultra liberals, they think that they are all going to be Elon Musk. We have to understand, why did the left lose these constituencies of people that have benefited from social programs? I wouldn't be here if it weren't for social programs in democratic Portugal. So we need to have, again, these kind of social programs. What I've, and I'm going to finish with these 2 or 3 examples. When I was campaigning for the elections last year, and at a certain point, the journalists wanted to know a lot about universal basic income. We had that in the, a pilot project for universal basic income in one of the lines of our program. It was not actually something that is a platform of the party. We just wanted to have a pilot project. For a week, that was everything, all that the journalists wanted to know about. We were dominating the debate. Before that, what was the main topic of debate in the Portuguese elections? It was the reintroduction of life sentencing that we have gotten rid of in 1865, which was one of the main planks of the right wing. I'm not saying that we all agree on either universal basic income or job guarantee or a Green New Deal or whatever, but what I'm saying is that if we come forward and we occupy the debate, as for instance in Spain they have done with the social inheritance scheme, that means that during the elections, people will speak about our proposals and not about regressive proposals by the right wing. There's also other examples of things that we should do. Maybe in the debate afterwards, I can present something which I call the Ulysses Project, which is about Southern Europe and the Mediterranean and North Africa. But I think that you see the gist of it, that we need to have examples of objects of political desire that mobilize people, and this mobilization will bring change. Of course, this cannot be just a hodgepodge of, this and the other goal. It must be bound by a vision. And here, to finish, because, I come from Lisbon and people from Lisbon like to make, as if Lisbon was the center of the world, as Maria João did with the Lisbon strategy. And maybe, unfortunately, some did with the Lisbon Treaty. I'm going to speak of the Lisbon earthquake in 1755. That was the moment where the political contract of absolutism collapsed. The belief that, absolutism was a political contract between subject, king, and God. And when something went wrong, you had to reinforce the contract. But the earthquake of Lisbon just, made that collapse. And it took us a while until we invented a new kind of political contract, which is the contract between people, nation, and state, which gave us lots of things that we enjoy. And it is a very important contract. But now we are faced we are facing a very different set of challenges. You know, I know an author that is very much to Stefano's liking, Norbert Wiener, in his cybernetics. He says that, he foresees that if we compete against artificial intelligence, we will become slaves. It's there in his book, you know, decades ago. And this is a challenge that is right ahead of us. What we need is a new kind of contract, a contract that is between humanity, nature, and technology. And this is what we must present. It is a new global contract. We must present our objects of political desire as ways to get closer to this ideal where we have a balance between humanity, nature, and technology, and we can live an harmonious life and eudaimonia, as Aristotle will say. So I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we certainly have a menagerie of different approaches, a subtle academic analysis of and a call to reinvigorate the, what should we say, the left-wing project, take some of the wind out of the sail, the right wing using something other than the narrowest political tactic. So, floor is open.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to ask a very quick question to Jenny because she was a historian. And before that, but I want to preface something. Patrick Weil is the guy who put in my head that it was okay to have two nationalities and not to be a traitor to either one. And I want to thank you because when I joined the Socialist Party 20 years ago, you gave a talk about nationality. So I wanted to say that. The second part is within the Socialist Party, there was a Belgian presenter who presented his book called I bought your book, La Vie et la Rue. He asked the question, how to persuade so many different people coming from different parts. In the beginning of the book, you talk about that. And so here we are with Olaf Palme and Mike Harrington. And here in the United States, because you made the call of arms, we have a problem. Mike Harrington is the creator of Democratic Socialists of America. And we have a problem in America where we have the left that is fighting all over the place without any historical thing. And one video that is shared around the internet within leftists is the speech of Olaf Palme in 1981, talking about his trip to America and why he became a socialist. So I wanted to know, because that speech resonates within the left America, I wanted to know, was he a socialist? Because the translation in the video, he says, I'm a socialist, and why he became. Okay. But was he a socialist or was he a social democrat? And that's my long question one. And the second one is, where do you put Mike Harrington in the social democratic spectrum in the left? That's it.
Oh, I oftentimes get this question, which is, please explain to us the success of the Nordic models and why you don't have them anymore. So I do that. And I understand that it's not a template for the world, but also I think it's a serious question. These were very successful societies for a limited period of time. And it hinged not on rocket science, but on things that are sociologically and historically explainable. And that's what I tried to do. I understand that not everyone is going to reproduce Swedish. That was just a first thing. Yeah, I think Olof Palme was on a tour to many places and he said, why am I a democratic socialist? And I think he probably did that because he was knowledgeable of the fact that the term social democracy perhaps did not translate so well in France, for instance, at that time with the fifth left. And in the US with the legacies of 68 and Harrington and the Vietnam Revolt. So I think he was very skilled with words. Which was, I don't mean that pejoratively, he was very, very rhetorically skilled, and that was important. I think Palme and Harrington would have stood on very different parts of the social democrat socialist project. So a quote by Palme, which was almost incendiary in its context in Sweden, was when he said to the Swedish version of 1968 that he was a reformist because all the revolutionaries that he had ever encountered had discovered reformism at 8 o'clock the next morning when they came into the office, right? So that was condescending of him. But Palme believed, I think, very strongly that reformism, so here is another key thing, I think, is not a short-term thing, but a long-term journey. And I think he was disenchanted with some of the European left in the 60s and 70s because they did not realize the long term of it. I think an interesting and forgotten part of Olof Palme's history is his attempts actually transnationally in the 1970s with people like Bruno Kreisky and Willy Brandt to actually rethink the notion of growth, not simply toward our notion of sustainability, but toward this third way, which was then the third way of a balanced mixed economy, not capitalism, not communism, a kind of growth that did not create social devastation and alienation, and that incorporated environmental. So, you got more than you asked.
Not enough, actually. I would like more.
Okay.
We'll talk later then. Thanks.
I'm going to take the fellow in the back first.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. As a supporter of Bernie Sanders and democratic socialism, I would like to ask you about another conflict, not between economic systems, but political systems. Aren't political rights as important as economic rights? And the conflict as typified by the Russian president's ongoing criticism of the West, and namely countries where people have the right to vote in real elections, because it seems like democracies are losing right now in the battle against countries where dictators stay in power for as long as they want.
Just one sentence. I don't agree with the statement that the West is losing. I think the West is losing sometimes powers of other countries, but the values of democracy, of right to vote, of right to freedom are world shared. That if people were needed to decide on these values, China and Russia and Iran, everywhere else, they would agree. It doesn't mean that they will agree with the capitalist system, but the democratic, they would agree with democracy of law globally.
I just want to form a belief and then say something else. First is that I think that what is going on in Europe with the war that Putin has initiated against Ukraine is a decisive fight between two alternative futures. One is European unity, and the other one is the return of a kind of new imperialism. That's what Putin really wants. He wants to go back to spheres of influence. And this all started in 2014 when the Ukrainians did not want to relinquish a deal with the EU that their then president had been negotiating, and that at the last minute he decided to not sign and go instead sign a deal with Russia and Belarus, and people came out on the streets. I remember being here in 2016, and everybody was asking after the Brexit referendum whether it was the end of the EU. There was even a book that was called The EU, an Obituary. It was a little bit like that movie, The Sixth Sense. The EU was already dead. It hadn't noticed it. And at the same time, people in the other, in the other corner of the continent, they had already died in order to be part of the EU. And this is something that I'm not exaggerating. If you ask many Ukrainians, now they are dying for their sovereignty, but they are dying to be part of this transnational polity. Of course, out as the other Eastern Europeans, this is a way for them to safeguard their national sovereignty, not the other way around. It's not a way to, subsume nation states into the EU superstructure, but still, that decisive fight will either in, few years from now, 10 years or something like that, either bring us an EU that has 30 members and encompasses the whole of the continent, or something else where the EU may collapse and we have the return of these spheres of influence. So it is a decisive fight with others. That's one of the reasons why I think that where at the moment where we are discussing these functions of globalization that sometimes acquire regional aspects. Someone has mentioned here in the morning the problems that you have in the Mediterranean that are also, problems that have arisen of colonialism, of the very difficult relationship between Europe and Africa, so on and so forth. You either try and solve them and tell people that there are ways to solve them, or they are going to create, they are going to be the bed where new authoritarianisms are going to be born. If we on the left say the way to do that is because we need to preserve social security and social welfare state, we need to go back to the nation state because we know how to do those left-wing things, those progressive things in the nation state framework. But we must not look the future in the face and understand that we need to solve this, globalization, sometimes with the regional aspect. I think that we are losing out and that people will be rightly so saying that we don't have solutions and better go, run into the arms of authoritarians.
Did I hear you well that you said we have to return to the nation states to preserve the social benefits, etc.?
No. I think that's one argument. That's one argument. That's one argument, but I think it's a kind of a facile argument. I think that because we knew how to create social welfare at the nation state level, we think that it can only exist at the nation state level. And it's not going to work that way forward in the future. And I think that we are deceiving ourselves if we say it worked in the past, let's keep this framework, let's do only politics at the national scale. Because I think that is running into the arms of authoritarians.
It's not at all what I said.
No, I'm not saying that.
I think there is an issue of, first of all, reestablishing trust in democracy. And there is no possible trust in democracy if people cannot feel that they are voting and repealing also. I think I didn't mention that. I think we have to give the right to repeal their executive power, something that happened in some American state. I think it's addition to democracy, but it can only happen in a space where you can talk to your compatriot, share, debate, and it cannot be. I totally agree that there is a need to internationalize, to have a European Union level of managing some policies. But Jean Jaurès, and I was looking, say, a little of internationalism put you far from your country. A lot of internationalism brings you back to your country. So I think there is no opposition between the two. There is a complementarity between.
Jenny, did you want to weigh in on this?
No, I don't think that nation and internationalism or global should be put in. It's a question of very delicate sort of considerations of what we are talking about. I don't think that the EU project has demonstrated that it's easy to transfer the welfare state to the transnational level. This is not easy. Perhaps there are parts of the welfare state that in fact are national also because they are firmly anchored in forms of political culture and sentiment and tradition and what have you. And I don't really see a problem with that. What I think is the problem is that the welfare state on the national level is exposed to a set of transnational problems. And it's clearly not acceptable for us, or anyone really, to have, for instance, illegal workers, people who are sans-papiers, people who have no social rights. But whether their social rights are guaranteed by Europe or by the nation state or by a combination of the two, I think is not a question of dichotomous opposites. It's a question of political architecture.
had two questions on here.
Yeah, I mean, just,
Synthesis.
I mean, along the same line, I wanted to ask a question about the national, the local, the national, I mean, the kind of multi-scale things that we are discussing right now, local, national, international. Of course, there is no contradiction between these two levels. I mean, they are complementary. I just want, because we're talking about the social democracy, I just want to have your opinion on that. I mean, first of all, the welfare state, I mean, or the social state, I prefer this has been also built on the extraction of wealth, not just from nature, as you said, Jenny, but also from the colonies. Don't forget about that. And also from the third world through free trade in a certain way. So in fact, I mean, this kind of national welfare state has been built on the cost of the global South. And we have to face this reality. And, you know, there are people who have been facing this reality, social democrats in particular, Gunnar Myrdal, first of all, Swedish social democrat. And then you have, you know, the Brandt report, because you were talking about Brandt and Olaf Palme. They were both writing this Brandt report in 1980s, which had been just completely forgotten after that. So there has been already, you know, this kind of reflections about how do you put together the national welfare state with a kind of fighting against global inequality. And you cannot have a viable welfare state, national, without looking at this global inequality problem, because it comes back through immigration and so on and so forth. So, I mean, you know, so what would be your answer for that? I mean, what would be the solution? And then about democracy, I completely agree. But what Paul was saying this morning, I also agree that, I mean, there is not one way of doing democracy. I mean, in not just national democracy, the local democracy, and in particular, the economic democracy within the enterprise is just so central, in particular, because you have multinational corporations, and that, again, you have the international dimension of that. I mean, if you forget about multinational corporations, now it's almost 70% of wealth, which is going through this international capitalism. So, I mean, you have to face this. So there should be a plan just to integrate, you know, democracy within these multinational corporations. So what are the plans here?
I would like to drill exactly in the same direction as.
Yeah, I knew of Maya.
Because, well, first of all, I think it is already great that there is an emerging consensus here that tends to oppose. That's our concern with the internationalism and the cosmopolitan approach on one hand, and the other hand, the need to belong to the role of a more active state. But for me, the problem, what is new now, from my viewpoint, is that this was my way to use the word multi-level sovereignty. What is new is that for us is not just about adding different levels of action. We need to find a way to articulate them more complex. Example, to have sovereignty on the role of multinational corporations. We need to have an articulated action at all levels, not just adding. And we have this in most of the areas of transformation of our life. So this is really a big intellectual and political challenge, because I also saying political because then we need to coordinate ourselves all the time. The permanent interplay. New way to make politics. But I would like to come back to the other issue raised by Rui on the role of feelings, because I very much agree with you. It's very important to put. And I must say that I would prefer to have our agenda based not on fear, other sentiments or feelings. And so I have a question for you, because I have not heard this word since I arrived this morning. The The word is emancipation. Do you think there is still a role to be played by this word? And if there is, I think the challenge for us is that we need to devise an agenda creating opportunities for emancipation at global scale, at all levels and at global scale. So we cannot have the illusion that we can conduct democratic program in our country at the expense of the others. Not only because this is unfair, it's because this will backlash.
Yeah.
So we need to understand this. It's the illusion of having socialism in one single country or a social democratic program. This is no longer possible. So we are in the major challenge of consistent political action.
To this comment, and also what said before, I think that we all agree that we cannot have social welfare state at the national level or even at the EU level without taming international capitalism, without having policies at the global level. The question is, then some people will say, but because politics at the global level or at the transnational level is so difficult, and I'm not denying that it's difficult, I'm just saying that it's not impossible. People will say, well, maybe we are going to have national policies that are welfare policies. We are going to have national politics to defend them. In order to have these national politics to defend them, we need to have international policies, but what we are not going to have is international politics. That will be the realm of the governments of the member states of the EU or the UN or what have you.
International Labour Organization, nobody is talking about it, but it is at the center.
And this, I think, is where we need. I'm not saying that we need to propose that there will be a global public sphere with a global citizenship, next year. But we need to remember that this is the original goal of the left, and that solidarity among working classes of different countries must count at least as much as solidarity, inside the political community. So what I think is that if we are going to have policies at international level, given the fact that governments change, they represent different interests, and it's very difficult to align their coordination, we are not going to get global policies without global politics, okay? That emerge out of a global civil society. And I think that this is part of the left territory, and it, I think, yes, comes with emancipation. The problem is people sometimes fear emancipation. The two big books on emancipation, that are actually short books, of the 18th century are What is Enlightenment by Kant. Of course, the Enlightenment is, humanity coming out of its self-imposed tutelage status, so it's becoming emancipated. But on the other hand, it's Candide by Voltaire. And Candide is emancipated because he gets a kick out the door by the Baron Tronc, meaning that some people have to emancipate themselves because they are expelled from the paradise. And if people look at the outside world and today they fear the outside world, they will lean into protection, which is another word that we have used here today. I think that protection is a strong word that we need, that the left needs to use. But if we only use protection, then we lose one constituency, which is the people that go ultra liberal and think that they don't need protection, and they go their own way. Lots of youth there. And also, if we insist a lot on protection, we are indeed saying implicitly that outside it's a dangerous world. Mm-hmm. And again, we are falling into the trap of the national populists who thrive on fear. So emancipation, I think it's a positive feeling that we must use in our political discourse, but without objects of political desire to conquer and without a vision of the future, it is difficult to explain
people, what are they becoming emancipated for? I don't know if this was.
The other two want to tackle this?
Feel a little confounded and a little alienated by this conversation. So I guess I'm just going to say one thing is that Sandrine and to Maria, perhaps it's that I think the 1970s was a missed opportunity and a closed window, right? Because of the multinationals and the Brand Commission, and because of the global warming debate and the environmental challenge, and social democracy in the 1970s could have created a set of global regulations that would have created a space for maneuver today that we find ourselves without, because we were only a couple of decades into the great acceleration when we know what has happened since then. Enormous acceleration in fossil fuels and capital accumulation. So this we can see clearly today as historians. Was it possible in the 70s to create a kind of global environmental regulation that took into account? Perhaps. It was discussed, perhaps. But I think that at least one of there were several reasons for the failure. One of them was concerted action by the multinationals. There was American counteraction to this. But another reason why was because of the fractured relationship between social democracies and trade unions. So this is why I say this is an unresolved tension within the social democrat project. And I think we have to see that it's there, and there's not I think there's no way of just cutting that knot in two. It's always gonna be there. But we live with the specter of a failed global regulation. I don't think there's any way. Historically, this to me is clear. And I think this had clear repercussions on the national projects of social democracy, including in the Nordic countries. Yeah, maybe I'll just stop there.
So I spoke of fear earlier. Response to fear. For example, when we mentioned the whole day how COVID permitted the European Union to respond by taking responsibility in healthcare, etc., because everybody was afraid of COVID. It was not because we have a desire of something, it was because we were afraid. And we are afraid of other things today. We are afraid of losing things like healthcare or free education. And we are afraid of policy of responses to global warming that will let mass of the population alone without any responses. So it is what I meant by responding to fear, because it's exact. It doesn't mean I didn't mean we have to create the fear. We have to respond to the fears, and that is for me the way Roosevelt responded to the fear of America in 1932. He has felt the fear, and I think in the United States, when you see what people respond to the fear of losing the right to abortion, the fear of guns, people vote on this, mainly on this issue. I love that people vote on desire, but there are more responding. Now, I would like Sandrine to respond to your very important question of the colonies. And I think from what I read that the high taxation that occurred in the United States and Europe after the Second World War was a response to the war, and it was a direct high taxation of the people who were not in the colony. But of course, the colony played a role. This is why I propose, that is a proposal, that, I mean, I have read, of course, the Gabriel Zuckman and the cost of tax evasion. And I had even wrote a paper on how we could punish the tax evader by not permitting them to circulate in country. They want to become citizens of St. Kitts and Nevis, but still want to go to Florida or to go to Venice or Paris and circulate all over the world. If you start telling them, okay, you can be citizen of St. Kitts and Nevis, but it's finished if you don't pay the taxes. And so we have to have a priority on that, because it's very difficult for all big countries agree that all the Chinese, even all the authorities. And this money could go to help Africa to face the growth. So we should take this money, put it in an international UN fund, like you have the Green Fund already created. And I think we should, because that money, people will be happy that we take that money. They will not feel that they are paying more taxes. And so we have to find ways of creating consensus and make it useful for our, what I agree, articulate multi-level sovereignty.
I've got 1, 2, 3 at the moment. One question in front, then back there.
Well, thank you to mention fear, passions, and desires. So we have a beautiful philosophical discussion to conclude this seminar about the future of social democracy. And I want to come back to fear, because I think this is a very important element for think of the future of the left. Of course, fear has played a very important role in politics. It's the architect of power, as Tavares said. Fear was the foundation of the Hobbesian idea of the state. Was also, that's a beautiful essay by Judith Shklar, The Liberalism of Fear, how fear led to the creation of the rule of law. But it's slightly more difficult to use fear as a basis, I think, for a social democratic policy. Of course, you can say you want to answer the fear of pandemics, the fear of hunger, the fear of misery, and that kind of things. And that's what part of the rhetoric of Beveridge or of Roosevelt. But at the same time, fear is a moment. I mean, fear is a moment to sort of canalize all the energies and the concentration of the mind, and then you have to open something else. The great psychologist Jonathan Haidt pretends that he is the one who convinced Obama to build his speeches in 3 parts, and he says 1/3 of fear and 2/3 of hope. So the contrary of fear is not desire, it's hope. So you need fear first to concentrate the energy and the intention. But if on the left side of politics, if you stick just to fear, nothing else, then you will never be able, I think, to rebuild a real progressive vision. You have to say, yeah, there's lots of dangers in the society, but we, the socialists, we, the social democrats, we, the liberals in the American meaning of the words, don't stop here. We have a positive vision of the future, and this idea of a positive future is so quintessential in the definition of what social democracy is, that if you abandon this and just leave it to fear, I mean, I'm afraid that you will abandon one of the key elements of what socialism has meant and can mean for the future.
Can I just follow up on that? Because we'll move, this is good, because that's fear, and I want to ask about desire, or maybe not ask, but comment on desire, but informed by something Jenny said that I think was really important about the ways the project of social democracy is so bound up with the modernist logic of both development, industrialization, extraction. It was of a moment that saw the nature as an endless resource and humans as a progressive trajectory upward. And desire, it turns out, is tied to that too, because desire is a temporal gesture. It's about something to be had in the future. In fact, once you have it, then you don't desire it anymore. So it's a kind of a promise. We think of it like the promise of emancipation. As a motivational factor, desire is best when it's something you're not actually going to get, because then you have to continue chasing after it, and it's what drives it forward. One of the problems we've heard throughout this conference about the social democratic project is the way, if I can use a Koselekian term, the way that people's space of experience no longer meets their horizon of expectations. This is to say, the promises offered by the social democrats for either emancipation or global equality or even just security weren't met in the way they expected. And that may be because of that neoliberal moment we talked about yesterday, but for whatever reason, that broke that bond of trust. And once you break that bond of trust, it's very hard to achieve something like hope based on future promises. So the question I have is whether the social democratic project really can be recalibrated. You spoke of revision, although I could argue that left-right moment is more about ex nihilo, being able to actually invent a politics out of something that wasn't there before. Is it possible for this social democratic project to be able to move past the modernist moment in which it was born, to be able to take on an existential crisis like climate change in such a way where you're not relying on the very factors that led to that climate change.
Can I just add on, and then we'll have finished the three comments and questions. When you were talking about fear, I continuously had to think of that quote by Nietzsche, who said, when you make a living by chasing your enemy, you have an interest in keeping them alive. And I wonder if fear becomes such a central focal point of political strategy. If we don't end up being in dependencies we don't want to end up in. So it might be at most maybe just a short-term strategy, but I think desire, thank you Ruth for bringing that up, I think is a lot more sustainable emotion to use in politics. So for the past years, I was trying to find out what are the desirable future visions of marginalized communities. And I was conducting workshops with several marginalized communities, and one of the biggest obstacles was to imagine a world where that one thing they fight against doesn't exist anymore. And so I've used different techniques, and turns out that desire, speaking about desires, is one feeling that allows to imagine a world beyond. And yes, it might appear like a temporal emotion, but it's not, because it can be, but if we use it in a different sense, such as maybe politicizing the lack of connectedness, meaning alienation, not only used in the classical political realm, but also in how, and I think this is one of the major influences on our societies at the moment, how the internet and the communications and connectedness people experience through the internet has actually weakened local connectedness, and how humans are now highly isolated, sometimes not even knowing their neighbors, not feeling any responsibility for people in their immediate physical environment. And that is a massive weakening of solidarity, which then turns into this sort of theoretical concept with now practical output. And so if the lack of connectedness, if alienation were a major topic in desire, if one politicized the desire for connectedness, I think that would be not a temporal desire, because that is something that needs to be cultivated continuously. And so I was wondering if there are maybe, we were talking about the objects of desire, what could those be beyond those you've mentioned? And isn't maybe the, people can be quickly mobilized by naming the experience they all have of loneliness in industrialized countries, of dependency on one another, but with the lack of solidarity, and the only way you can thrive is buying your way out. And we talked about care, and I think feminist theorists play a crucial role in here by redefining, for instance, freedom as something that is experienced through community, through responsibility that people want to take for one another. And also I want to just point out the work of Eva von Redeker, who wrote a book on, and she redefined freedom as the freedom to stay where you are. And with climate change forcing us to flee, climate change not only forcing us humans to flee, but also a species to go extinct. And so I think it would be smart and wise to redefine freedom, to look for new objects of desire, to mobilize people.
What's a lot on your plates, colleagues?
Okay, who starts? Who starts?
Oh, thanks, guys. Listen, I am not sure. I am not sure that the Social Democrat project is able to keep us alive into the future. I think that it is possibly so that we need another kind of political configuration, because we need to somehow bypass industrialism, okay, in the sense that we know it. And I think that one of the problems of social democracy is to identify desire with forms of consumerism and consumption and security. And there are arguably other ways of conceptualizing security, the way that you just did. But that's not something that is very easy to discuss in the convention. No, it's not. It's not a trade union discussion, for instance, no? And I'm also, one of the things I really dislike is the idea of the future vision. Because there is no future vision that can somehow be scripted by someone or fall down into our laps. And social democrat parties in the last 30 years, they've had all sorts of ateliers and studios and workshops. We're going to write the next future vision. And then there is something deeply patronizing in asking people, so young people who are living through completely different socioeconomic contexts than I did, for instance, when I grew up, asking them what their desire is when, they have problems of jobs, how to afford education, how to house themselves, people who are living in conditions around the world where basic material conditions are not met. I think it's deeply patronizing to ask them about their desire. I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I think there is a powered logic in that is problematic to me.
I'll maybe start with COVID. I think that COVID is and this European reaction to COVID, I think, is more an argument for how out of something that you fear, and I'm not saying we cannot simply not talk about fear. Fear is there. Actually, if you have to address it in order for people to resolve fear, but you can use it in a way where you explain to people how you come out of a crisis. I remember, for instance, at the EU level, discussing Eurobonds for 10 years. During the Eurozone crisis, Germany didn't want Eurobonds, etc. So in a few months of COVID, we had something that is Eurobonds. Call it whatever you want, but it's Eurobonds. We've all had discussions at the European level where you cannot do this or you cannot do that because the treaties don't allow it. The treaties also do not have EU competencies on public health, and yet during the pandemic, we were buying vaccines together, and those vaccines were the object of political desire. It was the way out of the crisis, and it worked much better than the alternative, which was the Bolsonaro or Trump alternative, which is, closing the borders and let the disease spread, which actually lost them the election. At least I'm convinced that Bolsonaro lost because of COVID, and Trump probably lost because of COVID. That's, I think, a great example where people on the left, not only on the left, but on the left for sure, can say that a transnational coordination, a reinforced World Health Organization, etc., can work. During those months, we lost a little bit our fear of being called globalists. Of course, there was lots of conspiracy theories about the World Health Organization anyway, but we stuck to our guns and we defended that we needed that multilateral organization, only better still than what it is. So I think that it is kind of a blueprint of what we can do with climate change, which was the second question. I think that we had a very important, couple of decades where we had to, also because we were facing something, someone has already said this morning, we were confronting the denialists, and we had to say, this is serious. And, the options that we have ahead of us with climate change is from, terrible to worst. But now we also have to have a kind of a discourse that we say we can get out of this. That is crucial that we explain people how we can get out of this. Secondly, the question of desire being a temporal sentiment. I think it is, and it's a good thing because we are temporal beings. Okay? We are memory over time. We wake up today, and we know that we are the same person that we were yesterday because we have memory. And we project ourselves in the future by using our imagination, which is a kind of memory. It works in the same way. Imagine, memory is a kind of a retroactive imagination. We reimagine what brought us pain or pleasure in the past. And imagination is a kind of a proactive memory. We remember the good things and we want to have them again in the future. And collectively, this works a little more or less the same way. We need to have a story and we need to tell a story of where we are, and where do we want to get. So I think with climate change, if we have that story, people will fear less and they will, coalesce more, we will have more solidarity, more mobilization. Why the alternatives could be fear against hope, or for instance, a hatred against love. Every election is a story, and the story of the Obama election was fear against hope. Maybe because I come from a Latin language where hope translates as esperanza, which means to wait, and it does not give you agency, you just wait. We are the ones that we have been waiting for, and waiting, I think it's not very, it's not a very socialistic sentiment. I think that we should be agents of change. I tend to think that hope is more weak T than desire, which is a stronger T. Hatred against love, it worked in the Lula versus Bolsonaro election. So much hated that there was so much hate in public speech that they could not bear with Bolsonaro more. I'll just end with this. I was reading Paul Magnet's book, and he has this quote by the Australian band, I believe, Midnight Oil, which is, how can we dance when the world is burning? And it made me immediately think of the famous pseudo Emma Goldman quote, if I cannot dance, then it's not my revolution, which is not what she said. Because, a few blocks down from here, I think in the Lower East Side, that she was dancing, and then another revolutionary came by and said, you should not dance like that. It's not of a young revolutionary woman like you. And she was furious. And she said, how dare you tell me to not dance? Because it's exactly what I argue for, what I defend is that everybody, he didn't say, if I cannot dance, then it's not my revolution. That was invented by someone who did the punk t-shirts in the 70s. But what she did say is, I want the right of everybody to beautiful and radiant things. And those were those were what? Theaters, public libraries, parks, museums, what Klinenberg calls palaces for the people. That I think that comes from, it's an expression by Andrew Carnegie, was describing his libraries, but it was, after all, a magnate giving palaces to the people. And what I think that we in the left-wing progressive camp must desire or wish for is palaces for the people, telling people that these are the, neutral carbon mass transport infrastructure that we can have in the future, the isolated houses that we can have in the future, so on and so forth. I think that this is highly mobilizing, that this can beat out fear. That's my final allegation.
I title my presentation, Democracy or Social Darwinism. When we talk about very early achievement or late of social democracy like healthcare, at the beginning there might be in affectionate relation, the desire is beginning after 40 years of marriage. Sometimes it still exists, sometimes it's not anymore there, but it's still the marriage. And I think the problem with healthcare is that until people discover that they might lose it, and so they are afraid of losing it, the desire has become an habit, and they don't even think that they could live without it until they discover it can disappear. And it is at that moment that they suddenly feel fear or desire, but the problem is to make them conscious of the achievement that has been made by the past generation that can be lost. So I completely thank for raising the issue of the internet, which we should have talked about before, because here you have all the thing that you have the multi-level, national regulation that comes, and the European protection of data, it is very important, but it doesn't change the issue we are raising, that it isolates people, it reduces the personal connection, and it is exactly the kind of thing as a social democrat or on the left we should respond to, because otherwise, if we are not able to talk in person, and I have in the book, I don't remember, then we are going to lose because the bombs that are coming through the internet and the fact that I noticed since I arrived back to the US in August, most companies, and even public service, has not brought back people to work. They are still working half-time from their home. I think it will have a big impact on the possibility of mobilizing collectively, etc. And so that's a big issue, I think, for the Democrats of the left. To Paul, who says fear you can bring only a moment, but let me come back to a political science text model I have used for 40 years, the garbage can model. Does it sound familiar to you? So a study of a university and show that, people arrive in the administration of the university, they can decide things, they are looking for things to decide. So they are looking for problems to resolve. So they are deciders, problem, solution, and resources. The four are rarely meeting. You have people who are here in the office to decide, but they have no problem to decide on, or they have no solution to the problem, or they have no resource. The day they have a problem to resolve, a solution to the problem, and the resources, and they are willing to decide, are very rare. So these moments are the moment where you can make the big changes, and you cannot, and you have to pick this moment. That's the role of politician, political decider, and they know it when they feel they can decide. It's coming, it's an open opportunity that will not last. So I respond to you that yes, if it even create a moment, that's a good thing. And now I would like to conclude with Rasno. What is very interesting in Rasno is that it was the same with Jean Monnet on the French side. It is that he had to decide in restriction of goods. It's a kind of thing we have to. So the time of war for Germany, a time of restriction of resources, and he had to reorganize the whole functioning of the German industry and the relation to the state, etc., in a rarity, a rise of rarity, something we have to face. And so that's very interesting for us intellectually to come back to the founding of planning, because it was a time where planning meant not not expanding the production, but managing rarity. Well, that's my conclusion. I don't think we should oppose fear and hope. They go together depending on how we talk. And I think they have to be going together and not separated, because a lot of things we want to win, not only give testimony of our good thoughts, we have to play on all these sentiments.
Colleagues, not everybody thinks it's great to be on the last panel of an intensive conference, but I'd like to think this was the grand finale.